Everybody, can I be heard? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. Good. So today we're going to try and bring it together, and I'd like to really introduce you to what you've already got. It's a heck of a lot. If you can make the ganses will produce the fields, and it's the fields that you want. You don't want the copper wire, you don't want the nanocoating, you don't want the GANs, you want the field effects. So actually with what you've already got from yesterday, all you have to learn is different configurations of winding bits of material together, bits of wire, bits of this, bits of that, and you can create those field effects, and then you can start creating all of those wonderful things that we've heard about. So with Malcolm, he's actually got local authorities interested in what he's achieving with the water. This is by putting a lump of rock outside a water container with a nano-coated plate, connecting it up just as you've got the capacity to do with your little boxes, and we're creating real change. You've seen us playing with the field transmitted from one person to another and being able to pick it up with one of these little voltmeters. So we are affecting real change, and I'm going to talk a little bit about health as well. But one thing that I want everybody to understand is that Mr. Kesh is giving this technology to us all in exchange for peace. That's the fundamental point. It's about peace. This is a peace process. So a month ago, it was proposed amongst the Kesh community that we had to sign the entire world to peace. And letters have gone to all the governments, all the presidents, prime ministers, and heavy movers in society to say, we want peace. And we expect you to come to Haifa and sign the world peace process. When? 3rd of this month, 3 days ago. And of course there was deafening silence. But the intention was there. And instead of the presidents and prime ministers being there, members of the World Council and Universal Council within the Kesh Foundation signed on behalf of each and every country. So actually, over the last, on the 2nd and 3rd of August 2017, every single nation was signed into peace through intention of a member taking over from the governments of the country. So the result of that, according to Mr. Kesh, is that has opened us up to the universal community. And we're only going to get to play with these advanced technologies if we sign ourselves over to peace. So although we've got the very beginnings right here of the plasma technology, what he's advising is that the next 10 years is going to advance us far more than the previous 100 years. We're going to see a really big escalation in the processes that are available. He even went so far as to say that those nations who are saving all their money to get into Boeing and so on and so forth for aircraft really should save their money, because within months we'll have vehicles for just a few $1,000s that will get us across the world in seconds. So I don't know what's to come. Like you, we've only got so much that we can tangibly see at the moment, and so I'm holding the faith and watching with interest. But I just encourage you all to play with it and just keep playing and keep seeing what you can do. The shungite idea was a novel idea, and look at what it's doing. So there's so many things that you can now do with the basic principles and basic understanding. So yeah, world peace, keep it peaceful, and let's see where we can go with it. Okay. So I have a naturopathic practice in Sussex. I use autonomic response testing, which is a form of kinesiology taught by Dietrich Klinghardt. I use mental field therapy, where I'm using the eyes to discover stress and then working to resolve emotional issues. Field control therapy is another field-oriented therapy where we're using homeopathics of organ tissues, sarcodes, isodes, and so on. I use heart rate variability to monitor the autonomic nervous system of the body, and what we're looking for really is stress. And I also look at biological terrain management, where I'm looking at urine and saliva to give me a hint of what's going on in the body. So this is an example of biological terrain management. What we're looking for on the left is the saliva values on the right in these two boxes. On the right are the urine values. And essentially what we're trying to do is get to center. So the bigger the shape, the more off-kilter the person is, and we're trying to bring them into center. So we're just looking at stress. If we look at heart rate variability, we're trying to get people into the green zone. If you look at the box on the far left, and again, we're looking at the autonomic nervous system, we're looking at stress. So now we look at what are these stressors: physical injuries, nutritional deficiencies, toxins, infections. At the emotional level, we've got fear, anger, sadness. And at the plasma level, it's inappropriate field forces. So all the time, we're looking at field forces. Actually, the field forces, as we saw yesterday, are formative. And then as these plasmas slow down, we come into the matter state. So instead of looking in this area, instead of looking at the nutrient that's missing or the emotion that is the problem, we can actually step up again and go to the field forces. And if we can balance the field forces, we can nourish the emotional state, we can nourish the physical state, and we can work downwards from the plasma. So this is a change of perspective. In the past, I, along with every one of us really, was looking for the weak link, and we were looking at that physical weak link, which is the organ that's given up, or which is the nutrient that's missing, or which is the thing that has gone wrong in the body. And still that's pretty much where we are in therapy, is you know, what is the item that has broken down. But now we can think differently and say, well, which is the field force that's missing that we can amplify to allow the physicality to change for the better? So the cocoon and so on, all of these, what we're doing is we're introducing a strengthening of the field forces that naturally come from the sun and the earth. And if we amplify those field forces, then the intelligence of the body can nourish itself with those field forces and put right that weak link. So the egg, this is a really fascinating talk by Mr. Kesh. It kind of bridges something that we heard of, I think maybe a lot of you have heard, that in the early 1900s an experiment was done where they took a chick, they deliberately didn't feed it any calcium, grew to a chicken, laid lots of eggs, they deliberately didn't feed it any calcium, they then killed the chicken, burned it to ash, measured the calcium, and they had this discrepancy with all the calcium that had appeared to make the eggshells, and no calcium had been fed to the chicken. So how was that possible? And what Mr. Kesh explains there is that it's a field force effect. So a little bit like your radio. We've all got a radio in the car and we listen to one channel, but we've got lots of different bandwidths. So you can just tune your radio a little bit differently, a little bit differently, a little bit differently, and each time you're tuning into a different bandwidth, and that's where a signal is coming. So you've got Radio 1, Radio 4, Heart, Internet, whatever radio station you're looking for, on a different bandwidth. So from a field force perspective, we also have different bandwidths. The CH3 is a bandwidth, the zinc is a bandwidth, copper is a bandwidth, and calcium has a bandwidth. So when a chicken makes an egg, the yolk of the egg has a very expansive magnetical field force. So magnetical is outwards, gravitational is inwards. So it has a magnetical field force at a particular bandwidth. The yolk is one, the second layer is the white of the egg, and the white of the egg shares the bandwidth and has another force, an outward expansive magnetical force. The interesting thing about the uterus is that Mr. Kesh explains that the uterus is an incredibly alkaline environment. And as an alkaline environment, it reduces, it pulls in very strongly. It pulls all the universal forces into the center of the uterus so that that's where the life can then be manifest. So now you have a Coulomb barrier where you have an incoming force from the uterus at a particular bandwidth, the bandwidth of calcium, and you have an outward magnetical force from the yolk and another outward magnetical force from the white, and where those three coincide, you get a matter state creation of calcium. So that's where the egg appears. The egg shell actually appears as a result of field forces combining at that Coulomb barrier, which creates the shell of the egg. Amazing. And if you have that concept in mind, then you start seeing where the amino acids for the being come from. So you could see the planet a little bit as the outward forces met by the forces coming in from the sun, and at this Coulomb barrier we then start creating the amino acids. So just like the bandwidth that created the calcium, we now have carbon, oxygen, hydrogen and nitrogen being created at that Coulomb barrier and then gravitating in towards the planet, which is where we are incarnated into the matter state. So we can see from there how much of us, 96%, is actually carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen and oxygen. So now you see why the CO2 might be the primary tool in health. Okay? CO2 is the primary tool in health because oxygen and carbon are the majority of us. So if we go back to the uterus being this wonderful force pulling the energies in, this gravitational force pulling the energy in, we need to understand that every time you have a magnetical force, you also have a gravitational force which is equal and opposite. And vice versa. So we have the gravitational force of the uterus pulling in all the field forces of the universe into where the sperm and egg have joined to create the first form of life. And because so much energy is pulled in to those initial cells, they have to expand, because all the energy coming in has to be met by a force coming out. And this is where the cells divide and divide and divide and divide. Ultimately, we have one being, and that one being has a soul. The sun is the center of our solar system, and the soul of the sun is the center point within the sun. The soul of the human being resides in the center of the brain. And the brain creates the physicality. So from Mr. Kesh's point of view, the soul actually is a vacuum right in the center of the brain. It's not a gland. It's not the pineal gland, the pituitary, or any other gland. It's a vacuum space. And the brain manifests with the left and right hemisphere, and all animals on Earth have a left and right side, and the left and right side comes through the interaction of the copper. So when we're using copper, we're talking about physicality. And copper divides left and right. So now we have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And if we're looking at this figure of 8 formation, we actually have two dissimilar halves of the brain, one stronger, one weaker, and this creates the flow which then leads to the emotion. And the emotion communicates down to the body, and the body communicates up through the emotion back to the soul. So the emotion is the transition matter. So we've got the physical body, we've got the soul, and between the two, we have the transition matter, the emotion. So we know that we can create specific fields with specific ganses. We know that with the leaf is designed to have a shiny surface on the top and a matte surface on the bottom. And the two combined create a bandwidth of attractive force, which is gravitational, and that's the CO2 bandwidth. We know that plants pull carbon dioxide into them. So we've then gone about working out how to replicate this process of pulling in particular field forces using particular ganses. So the four major ganses, the first one is copper. So this is very much for the physicality. This is for structure. And if we understand that, then we start working. When we're working with our ganses, we understand what we're trying to use for which purpose. So in the pain pen, for example, the majority of this is copper. So it's copper windings, nano-coated. Sometimes you could also put a GANS onto it if you wanted to adjust it. But just if we stick with the copper, we're looking at physical pain. So where would this be appropriate? This would be great for structural issues, so arthritis, rheumatism, just physical knocks and scrapes and bruises and bangs, toothache, because what this is for is physical injury. Not used for the brain, not used specifically for the brain, because the brain is a different frequency, different bandwidth, and that's not where we're going to get benefit. Zinc. So now we've got a GANS, which will help us physically. But remember, we go from the soul through the emotional state to the physical body. And the vehicle for the emotions can be the central nervous system. So if we want to work at communicating between the emotional to the physical, this is where the CO2 comes in. All right, so if you've got nerve issues, neurological issues, you want to communicate from the emotion into the physicality, the CO2 is your friend. It's the bandwidth that you should be looking at. And really, if you don't know where to start, CO2 is the safest, broadest, most comprehensive and most complete GANS that you can use, and it's the first one that you're going to make from your GANS tubs. So just to recap, the copper, you have a nano-coated copper plate on the one side, and you have a plain copper plate on the other side, in water with a 5 to 10% solution of salt. Sorry, and then the CO2. Oh, did I go to zinc first? I can see two slides here, sorry. Okay, so let's talk about zinc for a second. So the zinc then is the emotion. So let me just step forwards. That was the CO2. So we spoke about the CO2 connecting the physicality up to the emotions through the central nervous system. If I then go back, the zinc. So the zinc is then the emotional one. Okay, so the zinc is the transition state from the emotion to the physicality. It's going to be instrumental in recovery from brain issues, neurological issues. Very interestingly, though, Mr. Kesh explains that the skull actually makes the brain. So the field forces of the skull are very, very important. So you might also want to be using calcium to nourish the skull, to create the field forces to support the brain. A great way of making a calcium GANS is cuttlefish. So you can use cuttlefish, you can also use eggshell. Organic forms of the elements are best. So now we've got the emotions covered with the zinc, connection from the emotion to the physicality with the CO2, and then we've got the copper for the physicality. Right, let's see where I'm looking at. The last one is the CH3. And the CH3 is the energy. Think of it as the sugar. Think of it as as the power for the blood. It is often really, really helpful. Often when a person is ill, they're lacking power, they're lacking energy. However, there are certain instances where you don't want to feed something with additional energy. So remember, we're not treating an illness, we're presenting a field force. We're putting a person in an environment where there's nourishment for different bandwidths and let their body do the work. But it is advised that people with tumours and growths and so on shouldn't be exposed to the CH3 field. Interestingly also, Paul in Togo, who's one of the real intuitives working with the plasma fields, was introducing the fields to local people with AIDS. And his process was to use only the CO2. And he used CO2, and he gave them CO2 water. This is the plasma water, or the GANS water that he was using. He wasn't using the GANS itself, he made the GANS, and then he harvested the water day after day after day and gave it to them. And he told them to brush their teeth with it, to drink it, to wash their clothes in it, to spray it on their walls. Why? Because he's trying to create a field. It's not about the water, it's about the field. Now, how can you introduce the field in as many ways as you can think about? And you don't want to mix up the fields. You don't want to spray the walls with a copper plasma water and then drink CO2. You want to keep it clean. If you're going to make a blend, you make a blend once and then you divide it up. So if you've decided to experience copper with CO2 and zinc, you make your blend and then you use it in diverse ways. So what he did was he just introduced the CO2, and then they watched the viral load come down, and many of the infections disappeared and disappeared and disappeared. And the lady and gentleman I'm particularly thinking about became absolutely exhausted. And he got them to a point where they were just really, really tired, but cleared out a lot of their viral infections. And then he put the 4 GANSes together and gave them that and built them back up again. So my own experience, which I mentioned last time, was that I'd got a sting in my foot and then I'd been infected, and then I'd grabbed a patch in the dark and kind of slapped it on my foot and it really hurt. And it was the CH3 in the patch that I think accelerated the power of the infection in the foot. So there are times when you don't want to introduce the CH3. But if you've dealt with the initial issues and you're not dealing with something that shouldn't be fed with additional power, the CH3 is going to be great. And I have had people literally incapable of exercising, having a patch of CH3 on them and being strong, and taking the patch off and collapsing, put it back on again and they have the strength again. So it's quite remarkable how sometimes this field can be the difference between having a capacity to exercise or function and not. So here are 2 tools, 2 instruments. One is the pain pen, and one is the Energizer Alkalizer jug. Now I know that the Energizer Alkalizer jug is going to be a combination of CO2 and zinc. We already know that the pain pen is copper. Yep, you'll get one, I promise. And the question then would be, why would the pain pen work sometimes and not others? So my son was absolutely shocked when he'd broken a tooth and was in a lot of pain, and he just did this and the pain instantly went away. And he did that, it came back, and it went away, and it came back. And he looked at me and he thought, what on earth is this? But he'd smashed his tooth. It wasn't going to repair his tooth, but it immediately got the pain away. Okay? In another case, I've applied this to somebody's shoulder, it did absolutely nothing. What's the difference? And the difference is that when we're talking about copper, we're not only talking about physical copper, we're talking about the field forces of copper, and that's a broad bandwidth. And it's the isotopes of copper. So when we're burning the copper, or we're exposing it to caustic and burning it that way, what we're trying to do is get lots of different temperatures, lots of different isotopes of the copper, because the broader the bandwidth of the copper, the more chance there is that the particular bandwidth that's causing that pain can be matched. So if you apply the pen to a pain and it doesn't work, it simply means that that pen doesn't have the necessary copper bandwidth to match that injury. Okay? The copper is not physical copper. We've got to think of the field forces, the breadth of the copper. So, one of the ways to work with that is to make lots of different copper ganses and combine them. Each time you do it, it's going to be slightly different. So if you combine your coppers, you're going to get a wider and wider breadth. And at this time, it's very difficult for us to tell what we have and haven't got. Although, I am advised that next week, we're actually going to hear from somebody who's begun to develop ways of being able to see both the magnetic and gravitational fields. So we're getting towards the capacity to measure what we have and haven't got. Okay? So, and then the jug wouldn't immediately be covering all of the physical bandwidths. So if you've got a physical, let's say you've got an ankle injury, the jug is going to help the nervous system, it's going to help with the emotional connection, it's not going to be directly working on the physicality, but it is going to be working on the emotional connection and the brain. So this is why it's a very safe mixture. All right, so somebody with a stroke, you might not want to introduce the copper to the brain, but it would be very helpful for them to be drinking the water from the plasma jug, just to introduce that field force, see how the body can respond to it. Zinc and CO2. Okay, that test tube in the middle is zinc and CO2. And it's closed inside glass, so it's only exposing the water to the field forces. And one of the interesting ways to monitor that something is happening is simply to measure the pH of your water before you put it in the jug. Then you put it in the jug, leave it there for a day, measure the pH, and it will have become more alkaline without any... That's right.
You can mix the two?
The two are already mixed in that, yes. You can mix all of them. Yeah, you can. I beg your pardon? Would it be confusing to mix all of them? Well, if you think about it, we're in a soup of ganses all the time. So we are, of field forces all the time. So we are receiving these fields all the time. Now, the question really is, if you're not well, which field force do you think is going to be the priority to amplify for that person to absorb if they choose to? Okay?
And the water is the standard?
It'll work with any water. Of course, the better quality water you put in, the better quality water you get out as well.
And you're not advocating distilled?
I'm not. No. Because it works. In Togo they're doing it, in Ghana they're doing it, in all sorts of places in Africa, and their water quality is appalling. So it's doing the job. I'm sure you can. I don't think there's any harm in introducing vortices and so on, because you're going to structure the water in those ways. My suspicion is that the field forces from the ganses are going to be much stronger than the field forces from the vortex, but certainly, love and gratitude, appreciation, vortexing, all of those things create a better structure for the water, and probably it can then hold the field forces better. So, yeah, the better quality of the water first, the better afterwards. So that's your missing bandwidth. Okay, just think about, do you need a better nanocoating? Do you need different ganses? What do you need to do to broaden the system? So you were asking, or one of them's going to have more GANs and water, and the other one's going to have less. And a ratio of approximately 1 to 3 is good. So the strong one is going to feed the weak one, which is going to return to the strong one, which is going to feed the weak one. Oh yeah, great. So we're going to be making these in a little while. There are 2 different bag sizes. So there's a large one and a little one. And you put one side of the body and one the other side of the body. And as this one travels to this one and back again, if you're standing in the middle, you will normalize in that bandwidth. Again, it's the bandwidth that you've got to pay attention to. So if there's a copper GANs, we're creating a field force of copper through the body, and excess will reduce and deficiency will increase in your body as a result of exposing it to the field forces. So Oliver's middle structure over there has got zinc, CO2, copper and CH3 from the top down. Zinc for the brain, CO2 central nervous system, copper structure, CH3 energy. You can see the different colours. Again in Africa we see what they're using, and they've been making waters. So again, what they do is they make the ganses, they expose the ganses to the water, and then all they need to do is distribute the water. You don't have to make the gans again and again and again. You've just got the gans once, and then they produce different waters. So they've got CO2, they've got zinc, and they've got copper. And they're finding that typhoid and elephantiasis are being able to be resolved with these waters. So the copper is being very effective in elephantiasis, driving out parasites from limbs. Mentioned in the last talk that Fukushima was one of the turning points of this technology, and the CO2, I believe, is the primary GANs was used to help reduce the radiation poisoning from Fukushima. There were trials done on mice, and mice that exposed to tritium survived if they had the water of the CO2, so the plasma fields of the CO2. They also recovered from the influenza, so the workers at TEPCO in Fukushima were dying because of an immune system that broke down, and then the introduction of a virus, influenza virus typically, which would wipe them out. And the mice seemed to overcome those conditions when exposed to the CO2. This is a lady who has done a lot of heavy metal detoxification. You can see that her lead, mercury, cadmium and thallium are still elevated on the left, despite having done all sorts of wonderful chelation procedures and intravenous this and so on. And she simply exposed herself to the plasma fields through magravs and drinking plasma water. And after 3 or 4 months, you see the values on the right. The lead is still a little elevated, but everything else drops straight down. So it's a very interesting way of looking at the potential of detoxification.
John, was she using CO2 and zinc?
Yes, she was using CO2 and zinc. She also, from memory, had made herself a couple of mini health units. So like the coils that you have just made, she had a pair of them and was putting herself in between them.
What was the machine you used as
I believe it was a hair analysis. I believe it was a hair analysis. Yeah. So there's various companies in the UK that will offer these. You can do urine analysis, you can do a hair analysis, you can do a blood analysis. If you want to be really thorough, then Chris Shade's Tri-Test is the best, I think. It looks at 3 different heavy metal toxicity loads and can tell you where you're breaking down. So you can see whether the toxicity is being stuck in the tissue in the blood or actually exiting through the urine. So that would be the most thorough way of looking at it. Then the water decontamination. Again, if you're stuck without decent water, what's the way to clean up the water? And I think, Malcolm, did you use the copper in your pool?
Well, I mean, the copper was used in the making of the shungite GANs.
Right, so
But
copper was
that's
used in the
the only way,
shungite, in
okay.
making of the shungite GANs, so some field forces of copper
Yeah.
would be in it. And the experiments that I think these actually might have even been, no, I think this was after Fukushima, but before some of the clinical trials that were done. But this was looking at whether they could clean water using the copper. And again, particularly in Africa, this has been very, very successful. It's a very cheap way of taking toxins and microbes out of the water. So you can see here that you've got contaminated water. You add the GANs, you filter it through, and then just by adding some drops of the GANs water to the contaminated water, you're able to allow all the silt to settle out, and you end up with very decent potable water afterwards. So again, you don't have to keep introducing the GANs. You make the GANs, you take the plasma water of the GANs, and then you use that to decontaminate the water. So you're using water to decontaminate water, which makes it massively affordable. We've seen these now. On the left, you have health coils. You can see that these are just like the ones that you made yesterday. The only difference is that the central coil is twisted through 90 degrees. So you've got one running horizontally, one running vertically. And again, it's just to give you the field force strength, and you can see a plate of coils in front of the person, a plate of coils behind the person, and typically what is done is the power is supplied to the coils behind the person, and then a sink is used to the coils in front of the person so that the power drives this way through. Okay, so you've got less field force here, more field force behind, and that normalizing happens through the back. And I've heard Mr. Kesh say that he prefers for the neurological system to penetrate through the digestive system than potentially take all of the digestive rubbish through the central nervous system. That's why you have the stronger field forces at the back and you radiate it through forwards. And you can see that there's a helmet on as well, and that is to introduce additional field forces, so you've got the communication from the soul, the physical brain, down into the body and back up again. And you can see on the diagram what we're talking about is creating this figure of 8 that runs through the body. The top right, you can see just a pair of these coils. You've made one, you just get another one, mount them in that format, put your arm between it, you can get rid of your wrist pain, etc. So it's another way of working. If you want to specifically work on an organ or tissue, you can do it quite targeted. And the middle top image is just so you can get a close-up and see what that looks like. Some energy sensitives have compared the experience and the flow of the field forces from the different systems. On the left is the system which we just saw, 2 panels of coils. On the right, you have the rings of GANs, just like Oliver's put together over here. And you can see the rotation of the field forces and the difference between the 2 energy flows of those systems. Interestingly, Michael suggested that we put a coil top and bottom of Oliver's system, this end system here, and he found that that really centered the system so that it would look different again, I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, also, could I just say that the cocoon,
Yeah.
actually, that started life as an egg shape, complete egg shape, with a suspended seat in it.
Yeah.
And the energy there is exactly as per the first one that Oliver's got there. So it's a circulating energy like this,
Excellent.
very good for centering.
Yeah, so I don't know if you heard that, but the cocoon was originally an egg shape, and with the egg shape, you got the real center. Okay? So another way of introducing the fields is breathing, and it's actually really very important. An additional piece of information about the heart from Mr. Kesh is that we have emotional tissue and we have physical tissue. So the emotional tissue is the smooth muscle. So you have a loose bowel if you're anxious, because the smooth muscle of the gut relaxes. The lungs are smooth muscle, and these are under the control of the emotion. The structure is under the control of the physicality. So the striated muscles then controlled with the copper, smooth muscles controlled much more with the zinc. So if you wanted to work with the gut or with the lungs, you introduce the zinc and CO2. If you want to work with the legs and the arms or the torso, but muscular, tendon, ligament, bone, then you have the copper. And the heart is the only organ in the body which shares striated muscle and smooth muscle. So with every heartbeat, the heart's job is to coordinate the emotional need with the physical need. And it's that center point of communication. And every blood cell in the body has an address. It's like a taxi. So as the heart beats, it knows what's required. It's received the information of the lacking field forces in your left ankle. And as that heart pumps, there are just select blood cells which receive the information for the field forces that now need to be introduced to the left ankle. So blood for its sake is no longer the way we can think about it. You don't just take blood per se. Every cell has its own address. So with these different methods, you can introduce breathing of the ganses, and this is a fantastic way of normalizing the emotional state. These are some of the things that you can do already. You just make up your CO2 and your zinc, and off you go. You can apply the fields to different tissues. You can just have them close to the person. We can wrap them around a wrist or an ankle or a structure of some sort.
For breathing, could you nebulise the CO2?
Yes, you can nebulise it, yeah. Yeah, absolutely. And I've seen Armand do that. Again, you take your gans, you make the water of the gans, and you nebulise the water, not the gans. Okay? This is something that Mr. Kesh has tried to really get people to understand. The gans is like a sun radiating the fields. The fields are in the water. You don't want to consume a factory. You don't want to consume a sun, have it continually pump out. You want to use what can be then eradicated and eliminated as well. So if you're going to be breathing, you want to breathe the water, you can nebulize the water, that moisture in the fields will go into the lungs, but you're not stuck with the gans in the lungs doing more than is needed. So be careful to make sure that you're using the water and not the gans itself. Okay?
When you say the gans itself, is it solid?
Yep. This.
Not what's in that bottle.
You don't want the cloudy stuff at the bottom. This was interesting. This was Sabrina. Sabrina was suffering rheumatoid arthritis and was in a lot of pain. Had been for a number of years, I think 7 years or more. And she described it as extreme toothache in every joint of her body. And so she made up exactly what you've got there. She was demonstrating some of the ones that she was making, but actually the ones that she made, that she used, were much more like the ones that you've got in your hands. And she simply either put her feet on 2 coils or held one in each hand. And on day 3, she was mobile again. So these are really interesting things. Now, again, rheumatoid arthritis, what is it? Structural. Because it's structural, the copper is perfect for that situation. And I met her then in Dubai about 2 months later, and honestly, she looked 20 years younger than she looks there. It was extraordinary. So she's great, and she's continuing to work with that. She didn't dare bring the technology with her to Dubai. She didn't want it to get confiscated. So while she was there, she was without it, and she was being propped up with pens and waters and so on. And she noticed the lack of it for a while. But now that she's been doing it for longer, she's good. Yeah. She said that she just left it on in the room and it would call her. And she would kind of feel she had to go and use it. And so she'd use it for 20 minutes to an hour at a time. And as time went on, she needed to use it less. But the effects from a treatment would last a number of hours initially, and then a day or so, and then a couple of days. So gradually she was nourishing her system with the field forces, and her system would then recuperate over time.
All those coils are covered while they walk.
These coils are not covered at all.
They're not covered.
No.
So she's touching them.
She's touching them in this case. One has to be careful. So if you're going to touch the coils yourself, then really you've personalized the system, because now you've put your own DNA onto it, and now you're exposing the field, you're generating the field forces from your own DNA. So we kind of advise not to touch. The other thing is with touching is that she had more current running through than we've set up. Ours are, you can't electrocute yourself, but she actually had some considerable current running through these. And the only thing preventing her from feeling that is the proper nano coating. So it was really well nano coated, so it was a complete insulator.
Is that burnt nano coating?
No, I think this was caustic.
Was caustic?
Mm-hmm.
Right, we do.
Yep. Well, not the ash version.
Oh.
This is the hot water caustic, so steam caustic, so hot water and then steam.
Caustic soda.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So this is looking a little bit into the future. You saw Douglas with his apple on top of his cup, taking the field forces of the apple into the water, then drinking the water and gaining the benefit of the apple. This is a kiwi. This one is also on the website that Oliver's put together. The aim here is you've got the CO2, CH3, and CuO. So the copper, the CH3, and the third one, the white one, is zinc and CO2. And that absorbs the field forces of the kiwi in this case. But what Mr. Kesh is saying is if we work out how to do this, we should be able to arrange it so that if I've got a dodgy left kidney but my right kidney's all right, I should be able to absorb the field forces of my right kidney and then project it to my left kidney. So these are kind of future anticipations. And some of the things that he's proposing are just mad, just wonderful.
Isn't there a Russian scientist that's already doing this? Because I heard that the consciousness conference, a Russian scientist that was actually doing this through photography and plucking the field forces from the photograph.
I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, there are many people doing similar things. And if the field forces are basically a fundamental truth underpinning everything, then it doesn't matter what you're doing, you're working with this. All we're really doing here is beginning to understand what it is that we're working with when we're plugging these field forces and doing so. So very interesting that it's already happening. Yeah, really interesting. Okay, last slide. Protection from cold. This is really interesting. And you can pretty much do this already. So there's a chap, he's been experimenting, he's been trying this for about 6 months, but what he's done is he's taken little bags and he's put the Gans water of all 4 of the Ganses CO2, CH3, CuO, what's the other one? Which one am I missing? And zinc. And 60 mils of each. And then he's taken one drop from the other three and put it into the fourth one. So each of them is predominantly one field force with one drop of each of the other three. And then he's arranged them according to that, north, south, east and west in a room. And he's achieving 21, 22 degrees in the room when it's 12, 13, 14 degrees outside. So it's extraordinary. And what Mr. Kesh suggested is that he tries increasing the CH3. So the CH3 again is the energy, it's the heat, it's the sugar. So if you increase the CH3, he feels that he can then create even more of a temperature differential. The interesting thing was that although this chap had tried it several times and it hadn't worked, when he did get it to work, he actually had a Magrav, one of these, that he'd made down in his cellar, one end of the building, I think in the north, and he had the setup in every room, and it began to work. And then he had another property elsewhere, and he set it up without the Magrav, and it worked. But what Mr. Kesh was asking is, do you have a lot of copper in the building? And he said that he was an electrical engineer, so he had loads of copper in the building. But I couldn't quite understand from the conversation. I got the impression that actually the house which had the Magrav also had loads of copper, and the other one didn't have loads of copper. But there may be an interaction here that you're working off the ring main of the house, and so the copper component, the physical copper component, may be instrumental in getting this heat generation to happen. But again, no moving parts, it's just the field forces. Okay, so that's an introduction into some of the ways you can think of health. Thank you.
They're all copper, the Magrav systems are all copper. And some other people could contribute to the answer, but in one sense he said that it's because for the power applications, the 50, 60 hertz cycles in the power grids naturally resonate with the atomic structure of the copper, and so it helps the plasmatic fields to go through. But there's inconsistency in that report as well, so we're not sure. But the copper connection it's a magnetical metal, it's a giving metal, whereas aluminium is not. Aluminium sucks vitality out of the environment. And so does steel, as I understand it. If you look at the sort of paramagnetic, diamagnetic properties. So coal is Venusian, it's warm, it's giving. Yes, and Steiner as well. Steiner, Schauberger, it was always, the old wisdom, the folklore was to use copper for gardening, because it was a natural fungicide and pesticide, herbicide as well. It was naturally antimicrobial, and it had a positive vibration, if you like, compared to steel, which was more. If you cut yourself with copper, it doesn't get infected. If you cut yourself with steel, it does. So it's just the subtlety, the field strength is very interesting, isn't it? And the ancients knew this, and silver as well was very good for that. So Venus, and giving the feminine warmth of copper as well, I think is part of it. Did you have a feeling?
Can I just say, on the aluminium side, when we're working in Ibiza, we actually work with somebody who is sensitive, so she can see energy and she works with energy. And the key thing she said to me was, never use aluminium. It's absolutely poisonous. So don't even consider using it.
Okay, team time.
Pictures that you've given us of the use, are they going to be provided or are we supposed to remember all this?
Tom very generously has put a recording of this whole day together, so he's going to get it online and it will be available that way. Okay? Yes?
When you said that you had CH3 had reduced energy,
So where did I suggest placing the CH3 patch for energy? There are different approaches. So one of my successes was a lady who's been bedridden for many years, and I put together predominantly CH3 and then the other ganses with it, and then just made a field connection with the water, and she drank the water, and she felt her whole body come back to life instantly. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to replicate it. This is where we need more measurements. So I got it just right there. So for her, the important thing was to create, I believe, the CH3 in the stomach, to create the heat for the stomach to start working. With the lady who had neurological difficulties and was having trouble kind of walking across her own room, but then went off swimming the next day, she had a CH3 patch that she tucked down the small of her back because her legs were weak. She kind of just did it intuitively. Okay? So you can apply it according to need. Any other question? Yeah.
The research on heavy metal, problems in the body.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, I think I could see it properly. I didn't see aluminium on them.
You did or you didn't?
Didn't see the aluminium, which obviously has come from chemtrails.
I might have just truncated it for the slide.
Right.
I don't know.
Did you come across with any sort of common sort of pattern where the aluminium, heavy metals come from? Got into body.
No, we're not really at the moment looking at sources, but of course there are many.
Yeah, it's important.
Yeah. So this is more about the resolution than the source at the moment. However, if we look at the future, Mr. Kesh is looking very much at decontamination of the air and the water, so the environment, so cleaning up the environment. So it's a big, big piece. Yeah. Sure. Absolutely. Yeah. It does. That's right. Yeah. Hi.
Jonathan, I was wondering, what's the difference between, if you would say, between plates versus coils? And in terms of what happens, does the coil amplify more, come more out? Is it versus a plate? There's something happening between the two plates in our cells and in the health units.
Yeah.
But also, some of them show us have coils.
Yeah, the coils really accelerate the field. So the coils run the field round and accelerate it, and then change direction and accelerate it again. So the coils are, I suppose you'd say, static dynamic systems. Whereas the plate is more just a radiating plate. And then we also have dynamic systems. There's a spinning CH3 ball there, which is another way of creating a dynamic system. Yeah. All right. Thanks very much.
It was on the patches. Yeah. The lady who did the heavy metal decontamination, that's right. She's in Turkey, so the tests would have been done in Turkey. But Britain has systems too. Yeah? Was it off? You could hear me anyway, couldn't you? Yeah. On her website, she's got on our website, put up lots of things under medical, people who've been making the health patches and just sewing them into their pants and vests and bras and whatever's, just to keep them, wear them next to wherever their ailment is during the day. And their body just gradually acclimatizes and draws them the fields it needs, and when they're better, they get rid of them. So sort of armour, body armour. And they'd be drinking the water as well, because systemically and externally, just to have the fields around you has been found to be good. And so so now we're going to just have a tea break, and then I think just organically, when you've had your tea, just join. John is going to be full-time employed with the coiling machine again.